sugar. And then what happens is the insulin that has been supporting your brain, it's a little bit like, imagine you have a son that plays the drums really loud. So what you do is you put on earmuffs. Now a Brahms lullaby comes on, you can't hear it. Well, you are now used to these extremely high insulin levels, so you literally turn down the volume. Well, now when you need that insulin to support your brain, it's not there to do it. So you want to know if your fasting insulin is too high. Then the third part is you want to know about various nutrients, things like vitamin D. Vitamin D is involved, it's actually really a hormone. It's actually involved with hundreds of genes. It's an important controlling vitamin with hundreds of genes, including ones for making and keeping memories. So you want to know if you have a suboptimal level of vitamin D, which many of us do.
Yes.
Most of us are deficient in vitamin D. Most of us are deficient in magnesium. Most of us are deficient in zinc. 1 billion people worldwide are deficient in zinc, and most of us are deficient in iodine. Those are kind of the big four that most of us are deficient in. So you want to know those things. You want to know your hormonal status. How are you doing on your thyroid? How are you doing on your pregnenolone? So forth and so on. These are all relatively simple things to get checked. And then the last of the four is just what you mentioned earlier, the various toxins. And many of us are living in homes that are remarkably toxic, and we don't even know it. And so there are simple tests you can now do to find this out. And this actually is helpful. If you're exposed to these, you want to get that fixed, or you want to get away from that particular place. And certainly good examples, number of examples that have been published on teachers who were teaching in schools that had biotoxins and were not aware of it. And over the years, they ended up having all sorts of problems, from asthma-related problems to dementia to rashes to chronic fatigue, and on and on. So these are the basics that we want to know so that we can all prevent ourselves from cognitive decline and, in fact, enhance our own cognitive abilities.
Wow. So I'm going to summarize what you've just said, Dr. Bredesen, and I want everyone to know again, this is Dr. Duffy Spencer. We are Just Relationships, 90.3 WHPC, and I am interviewing Dr. Dale Bredesen on his landmark book, The End of Alzheimer's, the first program to prevent and reverse cognitive decline. And what you said, Dr. Bredesen, about that it should be rare, and it's an epidemic in our country, and as you say now, the UK, and what we can do. So besides reading the book, which I highly recommend, you find out in terms of inflammation, your HFCRP, and I guess you just ask for that on a blood test.
That's right.
And then you know that it should be above 1.0.
Below 1.0.
I'm sorry. Whoo! Below.
Yeah, you don't want inflammation. It indicates how inflamed you are. So you'd really like to see it down like, 0.4. We see a lot of people where it's 5 or 10 or even 20. This means you have an active, ongoing inflammation.
Thank you. And then the second is to look at your fasting insulin, and that's measuring your insulin resistance. And what is the test for that, or the?
Yeah, fasting insulin is one of the blood tests. It's a simple blood test. And then hemoglobin A1C. They are complementary tests, both related to your glucose metabolism.
Wow. Excellent. And then you talk about vitamin D, and I personally am on 5,000, and I know that a lot of people are vitamin D deficient because we live in office buildings.
Exactly.
Yeah. So my goodness.
And since your show is about relationships, this is the relationship between low vitamin D and cognitive decline.
Yes. Absolutely. So I know the average person who takes vitamin D would take 2,000, but because I have Hashimoto's thyroiditis, I do take the 5,000, and it's fine. And you probably can't recommend exactly the dosage, but just to make sure that people get their vitamin D supplements, as well as magnesium, zinc, iodine, and probably you would add selenium?
Yeah, for many people, that's a good one as well. That's a good point.
Yes. Oh, my goodness. And then finally, the fourth is the biotoxins in the home. And you talked again about the water leaks and mold.
Absolutely. And there are other toxins. If you've got pesticides around, if you are exposed at work to various toxins, if you have, for example, mercury in your mouth and you've got broken fillings or any sort of cracks, you can actually leak a fair amount of this into your bloodstream. So there are all these different name three kind of types of toxins: the metals, the organics, and the biotoxins, like the mold-related toxins. These are all important. They can all contribute to cognitive decline. So again, helpful for all of us to know these. And you can get the blood test, as I mentioned, at the website I mentioned earlier. Or you can ask your doctor, tell them, I want to get these things checked out, and get on a prevention program so that we can really see a reduction in the global burden of dementia.
And what about radiation? Should you say no to radiation from your dentist, at airports, that sort of thing?
Yeah, this is a really good point, because there are different forms of radiation. And you bring up a good point, exposures, and that includes not just radiation and so-called EMS and things like that. It includes everything from exposures to air pollution, exposures to cosmetics, exposures to pesticides and GMOs and things like this. So there are many, many different places that are giving us exposure, and our bodies are having to fight this stuff and to excrete it at all times. There is more and more information coming up about radiation and about EMFs. In general, the low, the low frequency, the low energy radio waves are less of a concern. The higher energy things are more of a concern, like X-rays and things like that. So please be careful. Now, one of the things that's been suggested is, how much exposure do we all have now to Wi-Fi signals? Is this potentially a problem? It's been recommended, as you know, you don't want to have your iPhone too close to your head. You want to put it on airplane mode at night or turn it off at night, or at least put it at least 6 to 8 feet from your head. You also want, a lot of people like to think about, okay, what about turning off your Wi-Fi at night, or at least making sure that you're not sleeping close to it. So there are some things that are kind of inescapable. If you're out there driving around on the highway, you're going to get exposed to air pollution. You're going to get exposed to some of these things, and there, of course, are signals there all the time. So it's just limiting so that your body has time to deal with these things. And then it comes back to, cleansing and to optimizing your ability for detoxification. There's actually a wonderful book by Dr. Joseph Pizzorno that came out last year, and it's called The Toxin Solution. Very nice discussion about the various toxins we're all exposed to and how we can optimize our ability to get rid of them. What we find, and published a few years ago, was that, in fact, there is this, what we call type 3 Alzheimer's disease, that is a toxin-associated Alzheimer's that hadn't really been appreciated before. So we want to minimize your overall toxic burden. As Dr. Mary Kay Ross says, it's like filling up a sink. Everybody at some point gets to the point that things are overflowing. So we want to do everything possible to minimize the exposure and to maximize the excretion of these things. And that includes things like doing infrared sauna, sweating, and then using non-emollient soaps like Castile soap, drinking filtered water, taking specific, fiber, soluble and insoluble fiber. These things actually all help your body to excrete the various toxins you're exposed to.
Wow. Congratulations, Dr. Bredesen. You are the first guest I have ever had in 20 plus years that has recommended another book to people. My goodness.
You know what? We all want the same thing, which is the best outcome for each person. And so we are agnostic. I don't advertise for anybody or anything like that. We just want people to get the stuff that helps the most. And I think Dr. Pizzorno's book happens to be very good. I've read it a couple times myself. I think it's an excellent book. So I recommend it wholeheartedly.
The Toxin Solution. And how do you spell Bredesen?
It's P as in pie.
Yeah.
I-Z-Z-O-R-N-O. Pizzorno.
Pizzorno.
Right.
My goodness.
Dr. Joseph Pizzorno.
So what we're going to do for part 2 of this series next week is look at diet. And I think that people are very, very unfortunately ignorant about the role of gluten. I know that more and more is talked about with gluten, and in your book, The End of Alzheimer's, you talk a great deal, you write a great deal about gluten and, of course, fried foods and processed foods and GMOs. So I think that people will be very interested to tune into next week's part 2 on how you can prevent Alzheimer's or reverse Alzheimer's through diet. Is there anything else you want to say about that? For now, we have just about a minute left.
Yeah, I would simply say that, as a scientist, I thought that this idea that, diet was something important for cognition was silly. I would have laughed at it 10 or 15 years ago. It's turned out to be surprisingly important. And just as you indicated, anything that gives you leakiness in your gut, anything that changes your microbiome, so things like gluten can absolutely contribute to cognitive decline. As strange as that sounds, and as much as we might not have accepted it years ago, it is absolutely something that is important to consider.
Yeah, the idea of leaky gut, it's just amazing how that affects the brain. So this is Dr. Duffy Spencer, and we are 90.3 WHPC. If you want to find us online, go to nccradio.org. If you would like a podcast of this show to share with your friends, go to nccradio.org. And we are also on iHeartRadio, the only public radio show on iHeartRadio. Thank you so much, Dr. Bredesen. Tune in next week to hear part 2 of the brilliant Dr. Bredesen. This is Dr. Duffy Spencer saying goodbye for now and wishing you great relationships.